Yeah, that's right, Spider-Man actually kind of feels like Spider-Man again. Joe Kelly's run so far on The Amazing Spider-Man has actually been pretty good, and fans alike are actually really loving the new series. In this video, we're going to look at issues 1 through 14 and how this run takes a massive but genius risk by calling out the failures of Marvel editorial and even previous writers. There are currently 2 arcs out right now. The first one involving Hobgoblin is the one I'm going to focus on primarily in this video, but I will touch on the second, which is yet to be completed, because there's still some good stuff in there. So let's jump straight in. The first arc revolved around the return of Roderick Kingsley, aka the Hobgoblin. The main idea was that Hobgoblin had a drug ring business masked by a cola soda business. He'd put chemicals inside the sodas and sell them around the city, poisoning the civilians of New York. His plan was to then mass produce and sell a cure for the poison, essentially manipulating the market. And of course, when Spider-Man caught wind of this, he wanted to stop him. For the first arc, this sat at the center of the plot and was the main thing that Peter was sort of trying to uncover during this time. On the Peter Parker side of things, however, Peter was trying to get his life together, as he usually does. Now, at first, this kind of seemed like any old Spider-Man book where Peter Parker's life is a mess. They leaned off the idea of the Parker look quite a lot, and it seemed like it was going to be retreading old themes, and it was going to turn into one of those, I guess we're back here again kind of comics. But no, they actually played off this idea really well. Peter ends up getting a new job, and a massive theme is about him losing that job and what that could potentially mean going forward. And it felt like they were actually dealing with the idea of proper consequences for the character rather than just him getting fired and then moving on. And that brings me nicely on to Peter Parker's characterization. This is the best Peter Parker has been written in years. He's grounded, he's flawed, he's trying to do his best but still stumbling. This is the perfect way to write Peter Parker, not just the tone and the consistent writing of the character, but his character voice is also on point as well. For some reason, the way that Joe Kelly writes Peter Parker makes you feel like it actually matters when he does lose something. And this nicely ties into the idea of Peter's childhood. Now, this is something that I never thought we'd actually need in a Spider-Man comic, but now that Joe Kelly's actually done it, it makes me feel like this is something that we could have done with a long time ago. Essentially, during the first arc, there are a bunch of flashbacks to Peter Parker's childhood, and essentially he ended up being a bit of a rebel when he was younger, hanging out with this guy called Brian. He actually ends up being the guy that gets Peter a job in the present day. Although at first it may seem like Joe Kelly is doing this to sort of win back the trust of the readers and the fans, since everyone loves Aunt May, Uncle Ben, and sort of classic Spidey stuff, he actually uses this really well as a smart narrative device. They aren't just there to connect the past to the present and to introduce us to this Brian character, but actually they use them in a really smart way. The flashbacks connect to Peter's current struggles and actually connect to the root of the character as well, creating emotional through lines about fear, responsibility, identity, and even loss. And loss is the main thing that I want to emphasize here. This arc is all about what Peter loses, and this is where the meta critique of the character comes in. Now, if you guys actually don't know what a meta critique is, it's basically when a story comments on itself or the problems within its own series or genre, almost like the writer, whoever it may be, is aware of the problems that have been caused by previous issues, and then the writer will use that same story going forward to respond to that criticism. And when it comes to Spider-Man, the way that these 14 issues do that is by putting Peter Parker in the firing line. We all know as fans that Spider-Man always loses something, whether it be his relationship, job, money, or friends. As fans, we hate that for so long Peter can't hold down a stable job or hold down a relationship after Mary Jane from One More Day. Joe Kelly makes a huge point out of this by calling it out and reflecting it back onto Peter Parker's character. During the first couple of issues, Peter becomes self-aware and fears loss itself. During the flashback scenes, there's a massive hangover about Peter losing his parents at a young age and him being afraid to lose Uncle Ben and Aunt May. And that very intelligently wraps back around to the present day, as the fear of everything that he's lost up until this point in his history hits him all at once. Joe Kelly uses the frustration and anger from the fans to fuel this internal realization for the character, which I think is genius. During the first couple of issues as well, it's also revealed that the character Itsy Bitsy is actually working with the Hobgoblin. Now, if you guys don't know who Itsy Bitsy is, yes, that is a real name for a real character in these comics. But essentially, Itsy Bitsy drugs Peter with a toxin, which gives him hallucinations, which also ties into the past and the flashbacks from Peter's childhood. And as the story progresses, Peter starts becoming self-aware of his own failures. He starts becoming self-aware of the fact that he always loses. And they even do a whole panel where they focus on the fact that Peter has lost the love of his life twice. They make a whole emphasis about how Mary Jane Watson and Gwen Stacy have slipped through Peter Parker's fingers. If that's not a meta critique on the failures of the ASM books and the complaints of fans throughout the years, then I don't know what is. At the end of the day, it's a clever, self-aware way to acknowledge everything wrong with the Spider-Man comics while trying to move forward. And I feel like that's what Joe Kelly is really trying to do. He's trying to acknowledge the complaints that the fans have had for years and sort of saying, yes, this is the way Spider-Man is, this is the way Spider-Man has been, let's just move on. But how do we move on? How can we give Spider-Man and Peter Parker a stable relationship, a stable job, a stable story, a stable way of being without changing the character 10 years down the line? Because as fans, we've known that for all too long now. It's gonna happen again at some point, so how do we move forward? And that's where Shay Markin comes in. Now, I actually posted a poll a few days ago asking you guys if you thought Shay Markin was a good character, and 90% of you said no. I think a little bit of that was tied to the fact that she's not Mary Jane Watson, and I think a lot of fans of the Spider-Man comic books just really want him to get back with MJ. And don't get me wrong, I completely agree, but also I think Shay is a massive anchor point of this story. And I think going forward, when Joe Kelly hits issue 30, 40, maybe even 50, I think we're going to see this play out even more. I think Joe Kelly is going to use Shay Markin as a massive anchor being when it comes to this arc of loss for Peter Parker. Currently, Shay Markin and Peter Parker aren't exclusive in the story. There's teetering back and forth of eventually these two characters coming together and dating. But at this moment in time, they're kind of seeing other people. Like, for example, Peter does hook up with Black Cat at one point, and Shay also says that she's seeing and dating other men. So they aren't actually exclusive, but they're right on the edge of being exclusive. Shay is almost certainly going to be Peter's girlfriend at some point. And Peter also acknowledges the fact that he wants to be with Shay. He wants Shay to be his girlfriend. And what I think is really interesting is Shay says the only way that she's going to end up dating Peter is if he stops being so unreliable. And ironically, that's sort of the issue us fans have with these Spider-Man comic books. We're only going to trust the process of the ASM books again when they stop being unreliable. So yeah, not many fans like Shay's character. A lot of people think she's disinteresting, or there's not anything about her, or she doesn't have any chemistry with Peter Parker. But at the end of the day, Shay kind of represents us in this situation. She doesn't want to get in a relationship with Peter Parker the same way we don't want to trust that Peter's going to have a long-term relationship with Shay as a character. All because of the way that these books have been treated before. And I think that's why Shay is going to be used as an anchor point for this story of loss, this story of meta-critique. And I think that's genius by Joe Kelly. Shay, at the end of the day, represents stability and hope, and that Peter's life might finally move on beyond endless tragedy. In one of the issues, Peter even remarks that his life is actually pretty good, despite still being Spider-Man and failing and sort of tripping over himself every now and then. His life's actually going in the right direction. However, let's move on to the next arc and something that I really don't like, and that's Norman Osborn as Spider-Man. Now, don't get me wrong, Norman Osborn in this run is actually written really, really well. And the same way that Joe Kelly has introduced a bunch of flashbacks for Peter Parker's character, they've done the same thing with Norman Osborn. There's been a massive emphasis on showing Norman's past and adding a lot of depth to that character, which I really like if the context wasn't the fact that he was Spider-Man. So essentially, Peter fights this villain called Hellgate, and essentially Hellgate wants Spider-Man to be stronger. Hellgate sends Peter away to this otherworldly planet for him to gain strength. In the absence of Peter Parker and Spider-Man, Ben Reilly takes the place of Peter Parker, and Norman Osborn takes the place of Spider-Man. Now, the reason Norman does this is because he has everything to owe to Spider-Man. Peter essentially gave him a second chance after becoming the Green Goblin, and has decided that Norman deserves the right to change. and Norman having to owe everything to Spider-Man then takes the place of Spider-Man to preserve Peter's legacy, which I think does make sense. Also, Norman has this massive ongoing feud with Roderick Kingsley. Norman also wants to put Roderick Kingsley behind bars after the scandal in the first couple of issues, so he takes up the role of Spider-Man to continue that lineage and to continue that story on forward to try and put Kingsley behind bars. So the story does make sense, but can we just retire Norman Osborn? I've been saying this for years, and when Zeb Wells was doing his comics, and when Norman was actually written pretty good in Zeb Wells' run, I said the same thing. Like, we need to retire Norman Osborn. We need to get him out of these books. The longer we have Norman Osborn sticking around in the Amazing Spider-Man books, the longer we're going to be held back to square one. And yes, Joe Kelly does look like he is moving in the right direction with the story and the characters, but having Norman Osborn around just doesn't sit right with me. At the end of the day, he still killed Gwen Stacy, and Kelly even put a massive emphasis on the loss that Peter felt when he lost Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane Watson, and Norman Osborn was directly responsible for one of those causes. So what the hell are we doing with Norman Osborn in this book? I've got no idea. He needs to go. He's gotta go. But either way, he is being written pretty well, so I don't have any more complaints other than the fact that I just don't like Norman Osborn being in these comics. Another thing that I also don't like about these comics, and it was only mentioned briefly in the ASM books, but it's something that I don't like, is Mary Jane Watson as Venom. This is just... I don't get this. This just, no, please, just, I don't like MJ having powers. Like, what's the point? It takes away everything special about her character. Either way, the new Amazing Spider-Man books are actually pretty good. And in the next few issues, we're going to learn a lot more about what's happening with Peter, how he's going to actually end up coming back to Earth. And I plan to cover those issues when they do come out. So make sure you subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my review on those issues.